proposed in The Voice is nothing different to what we've had ever since Whitlam. Every government between Whitlam and Howard created their own Aboriginal Advisory Committee, which they didn't take any notice of, and they weren't obliged to take any notice of, and which, when the advice coming from that advisory committee wasn't to the liking of any particular government of any particular persuasion, they simply knocked it off and created another version of their own. They never needed a referendum to do that. They were all legislated, so what's being proposed today is nothing different to what we've seen a dozen times before, and history clearly shows us, and I'm saying this as a professor of history now, history clearly shows us that governments do not take the slightest bit of notice of Aboriginal advisory groups, be they committees, be they called a voice, or doesn't matter what you call them. There's no obligation on governments to take the slightest bit of notice. Aboriginal people can have a voice, but, if governments don't take any notice of it, then what's the point? History has shown that was the fate of every single Aboriginal federal advisory committee that had ever been created.
You don't think entrenching it enshrining it in the Constitution will make any difference at all?
What does enshrining it in the Constitution mean? It just means that governments can't disband it. It doesn't mean that governments have to take any notice of it. There's no obligation whatsoever. As always, there's no obligation that governments have to listen to the voice. They can say, okay, thank you for that advice, now piss off. And we'll do what we were going to do anyway. And that is what has happened in every instance of every federal Aboriginal advisory body since Whitlam. Why should we suddenly expect that things are going to be different just because this completely useless voice is embedded in the Constitution? Big deal. So what? It changes nothing that we haven't seen before. The only reason people are gullible enough to be conned into thinking this is a good thing, I suppose, is because they know that it's going to make them feel good. That's all the 1967 referendum achieved, was making a nation of white Australians feel better about themselves. And they thought to themselves, now we can forget about the black bastards just like we've forgotten about them for the last 100 years or so. And so it was. And so it will be again.
And history will show us that.
Well, I mean, anyone who reads history and understands history, it's there. It's all in the history. It's all there for people to see what will. I mean, I don't have to be a clairvoyant to predict the future on this voice nonsense. History clearly shows me. History clearly guides me. The evidence is there. And if governments are not creating anything different than they have before, and, this whole referendum is completely unnecessary. They don't need a referendum to create the sort of voice they're talking about. Government just simply legislates for it. And then when they're sick of it, they close it down and legislate for something else, which has happened constantly since Gough Whitlam created the first Aboriginal advisory body in 1973.
So, if it didn't go ahead though, if Australia didn't vote for it, given that this is all that we've got at the moment, would that make it worse?
Yes.
Yeah.
But, the people who have proposed this whole fiasco should be the ones who take the blame for that. It's their fault. I predicted early in the piece that the referendum wouldn't get up in the sort of Australia we got today, there's a high bar for referendums, you got to overcome. And 67 was the biggest yes vote in Australian history. Remains so. You're not going to get that again. I mean, Australia today is a lot different place to Australia 1967. There was still a reservoir of goodwill out there in the broader Australian community, even though they didn't really give a fuck about us and didn't want us living next to them. There was still a reservoir of goodwill that enabled a vote like that. However, since 1967, we've had 40 years of history and culture wars. We've had, Pauline Hanson One Nationism. We've seen the recent venturing out of the shadows of neo-Nazi movements and things like this. We've got the Murdoch tabloids these days, and he's especially rabid Sky After Dark TV channel. All of these things have contributed to a far more divided country today in terms of attitudes to issues of race, and the sort of the white backlash is well and truly evident today. Aboriginal people had a great upsurge of successes up until just after the Aboriginal embassy, and that back then people were predicting that there would be some sort of white backlash to all this sudden change whereby Aboriginal people were gaining, minor levels of justice for the first time. And the white backlash began then, and it's in full swing as I speak to you today, and evidence is everywhere. Just go and watch Sky After Dark on any given night.
Well, that is completely depressing. It is, isn't it?
Well, doesn't worry me anymore because I've only got a few more years out putting up with it. And I've got confidence in the younger generation who display attributes very similar to my generation, which is probably not coincidental, given that so many of them are in fact the grandkids of people who were activists back in my day.
Yes. That's something to clutch onto, I reckon.
And I mean, let's face it, in terms of information technology, what is available to the generations today is truly extraordinary. Back in 71, when we're talking about time of the Springbok tour, you might remember that most people, well, nobody had mobile phones. Not many people had phones. Yeah. And more often than not, you had to go down to the local telephone booth with a pocket full of 20-cent coins if you wanted to ring somebody interstate, And so the possibilities that exist with instant communication anywhere in the world these days have got to be, I always thought that social media and the information technology as it emerged would be a great thing for people who believe in social justice. But the internet has turned into a sort of a bit of a Frankenstein monster in certain ways, and social media, rather than enhancing the organising possibilities of social justice activists, seems to have done the opposite, which people all being absorbed in their own individual world and wanting to create their individual identities on social media and stuff. But, maybe that's just an old man grumbling.